Hello everyone, this is Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. This is where we talk about some aspect of making music. We take a look at music with respect to composition, arranging, improvisation, playing by ear, all sorts of aspects of the creative process. And as we have been doing for the last couple months, and we'll continue doing another month or two, we're going to be looking at harmony. Always one of my favorite subjects, of course, but this is the subject of the course we've been working on. And so we are talking specifically about secondary dominance. That was the topic of last week and this week. And I've made this observation before, but I'm going to say it again. I think this is the single most important thing to really get a handle on in all of music theory. So much else you just sort of wing it, you figure things out by ear. This is the thing that really makes the biggest difference. And so Martha's asking, can you still attend these master classes afterwards? Yes, the master classes are free to attend. There will be projects and so forth that I will continue to do for gold members, and we'll have little mini courses and things like that. But I definitely intend to maintain access to the master class. We might change some things about the structure of things. I don't know if you guys have noticed, we've been getting spam. I've had the community for 2 years, and this week we've just had our first 4 spam messages. I don't know what's going on. So anyhow, yeah, there will be some structural changes coming after the harmony course ends, but after that, we'll figure it out. So, Rod has a nice specific question that I'm going to try to answer because it's a good question that comes up both in the context of the current subject of secondary dominance, but it also is going to come up next week when we start discussing borrowed chords. All right. So Rod is asking about minor 7 flat 5 chords, otherwise known as half diminished chords. All right. Well, let's talk about it in the context of my masterclass theme music. It's basically in the key of A minor, and yes, there's a leading tone in there too, right? So we can have both sevenths. The 2 chord is naturally a minor 7 flat 5 chord. So I totally expect my 2 chord to be minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished, right? Also, if I am trying to tonicize a minor chord, like if I have a song that's in the key of, say, C major or maybe F major, maybe I got a song in the key of F major, and then somewhere in it, I want to tonicize an A minor chord, I can give it its own 2/5, right? So the E in the key of, if I'm in the key of F and I'm trying to get to A minor to tonicize that chord, I can give that A minor a secondary dominant, but anything 5 can do, 2/5 can do better. So 2, 5, 1 to tonicize that A minor chord. So in the context of secondary dominance, what I would say is we're going to use that minor 7 flat 5 chord as the 2 in a secondary 2/5. So if you're using a secondary 2/5 to tonicize a chord, and that chord is a minor chord, you absolutely will want to use the minor 7 flat 5. But even if you're tonicizing a major chord, it can sound kind of nice too. Even if I'm in the key of F and I want to tonicize my C chord, I could possibly give it I can do that. I'd have to think about where it's going to fit with the melody and so forth. But what we're going to see next week, especially, is that use of minor key sounds, even in major keys. That's a thing. That is actually the subject of the next section of the course on borrowed chords. All right. So have I answered questions that have come in? And by all means, be asking me questions about all the material that we're covering here. And I'm happy to be answering questions. But also, we're going to be, looking at music. And there's all sorts of music that's been submitted here that that we can talk about. And so I want to try a couple of things. I mean, I listened to a whole bunch of pieces and I've already given comments. I haven't, ones that ones that were posted last night, I haven't gotten to yet. But yeah, I want to talk about some things here. So let me see if I can first just get this window to be a reasonable size where I can see the music and see the chat. And there we go. All right. So I'm going to play through this piece that Graham posted here. And this is a traditional song that I'm not familiar with, right? You know, from everyone has their own parts of the world and you know your traditions. And I don't know this one. And so it was really interesting to me to hear some of what was happening. So I'm going to play first his basic 1/4/5 version and then his secondary dominant version, and then talk about some of the questions that I had. I want to try some things out and see what we think. So here's the original. I used an inversion there for no good reason. And going on. So this is all very straightforward as far as giving 1s, 4s, and 5s to this. You know, there's maybe a couple places where we could have made a couple other observations. And the biggest one that I had a question about was that middle phrase, right? This is basically an AABA form, and that B phrase that my question really is about coming back to the 1 in the middle of the phrase and whether that's the best place to come to or whether there's something else that can happen. And the thing is, not knowing this song, I don't know the standard harmonizations. But I'll tell you what I'm thinking right now. If I can make that be a 3 chord instead, maybe I'll like that. Maybe I like that as a kind of softening of this because I just don't want there to be too much 1. But then I'm also worried about the coming back to 1 here. It feels like that third phrase in a lot of these songs would typically end on a 5 chord. Typically in these AABA forms, we expect the second and fourth phrases to end on the 1 chord. The third phrase to end on a 5 chord. The first phrase could either end on a 1 or a 5. But that's kind of the normal expectation based on, you know, how so many songs go. And so the fact that the melody comes back to the tonic, okay, the melody comes back to the tonic and it makes me feel like, okay, yeah, the tonic chord makes sense, but it also makes me want to find alternatives. And so what I was wondering about, and what Graham said he tried and he didn't like, was trying to come to a 4 chord here, because a 4 chord would totally work with that melody. You know, I could be okay with that. If I play that whole phrase, I'm going to go to 3. And now instead of going to the F chord now, since I'm going to come to it later, I'm going to go to A minor. Come to F here. I put a secondary dominant coming to F. So I'm just experimenting with things I could do to make me be a little happier with the basic harmonization of that phrase, because that was one that I struggled with. The other thing I wonder about is, well, what if it were a 6 chord? What if it were an A minor chord? Could be pretty happy with that too, as just a way of making that third phrase end with something other than C. Anyhow, what Graham came up with is really nice in there, and I want to show that. And really everything that he's done is really nice here. So one thing he has done, when he says part 2, this is really, his reharmonization now using secondary dominants. He's elected to start the piece not on a 1 chord. And that's fine. You're allowed to make that substitution right off the bat if you want. Now, I'm not going to read his piano, his counterpoint and so forth in there. I'm just going to go off the chords, because that's what I want to focus on here, is what are we choosing the best chords? And then once we've chosen the best chords, then we worry about how to arrange them. So I'm going to play off his chords. Nice. So I'm going to talk about that phrase first, because then he uses essentially that same harmonization in the third phrase. In the second phrase, he uses a different harmonization in the last phrase, even though it's the same melody. But let's talk about that melody, this one first. So he's got the 5 chord here, like he had originally. His original harmonization had the 5, but then a quick little secondary dominant. So that's really nice. If you wanted, you could make that G7, instead of being G7, be G minor 7, because now what we'd be doing is turning those 2 bars into a secondary 2-5. So 2, 5, 1 in the key of F. And so this is a point that I can't believe I haven't made yet. I can't believe I haven't made this point yet, but you're going to hear it again. It's not either or. We're going to see that melody 3 times in this piece. So you don't have to decide once and for all, I like G7 better than G minor 7, or vice versa, right? You can choose to do it one way one time and another way the next time. So what I might do here is start with the simpler version, the more diatonic version. And then maybe I wouldn't even start with the E minor. Maybe I would even keep it that simple. That way. But then in the second phrase, do the other version. The second phrase is a little different, isn't it? Or is that just a typo? Should that D be an E? I want to say that D should be an E. Yeah, past should be an E. All right, so here we go. So that second phrase, this is where we're going to generate a lot of interest, because yeah, most melodies are going to have repetition, the same phrase presented multiple times, whether it's an AABA form or ABAC, whatever the form of your melody is, chances are there's going to be a phrase that is repeated in multiple places within the piece. And it's going to be to our advantage to explore options so we can use different harmonizations at different places in the piece. And as I said, he does that at the end. So let's look at his last version. His last version, he starts off with an A minor over a C. And then goes to an A minor there instead of an A7. And then 2, 5, 1. I don't think I played out the rest of the other phrase. But so yeah, this is a slight variation on what he did the other times, and that's what we're looking for. You want these slight variations. So there were a couple things that happened. Colleen, that's a great question. Does that happen somewhere in here, the D7 going to D minor, or is that a thing that you wanted to hear happen and didn't happen? Is that actually a thing in here? I think that's not a thing in here, but it is a thing, right? So let's talk about that. In the key of C, sometimes we're going to have D7 going to D minor 7, then G7. That is definitely a thing. Sometimes we'll have that dominant 2, then minor 2, then 5, then 1. And the thing to think about, yeah, it happens lots of songs. So that is a common thing, to have that dominant 2 not go directly to 5. I've talked about it in a different context. I talked about dominant 2 going to that, the 1, 6, 4 to 5. And what I've said about that is treat it as a group. treat the 1, 6, 4 to 5 as sort of a fancy 5 chord. So 2 to fancy 5, right? Dominant 2 to fancy 5 to 1. So your secondary dominant doesn't have to go absolutely directly to its target chord. That target chord could be fancified. All right. Well, this is what that minor is also. We have our dominant 2 going to fancy 5 because this 2-5 is just 5. Right? That is the thing. That is the anything 5 can do, 2-5 can do better. This is just 2-5 trying to do a better job of fiving. I'm making up words all over the place here, right? So think of that 2-5 as another fancy 5. So what we really have is dominant 2 going to fancy 5. So there you go. That's an interesting fact about Down by the Sally Gardens. So it's been translated, and yeah, because I don't really know this song. There's an aspect of it that sounds vaguely familiar. Oh, and Stephen, we're going to talk all about the 4 to minor 4 to 1 also. That's next week's topic, big time. Oh, by the way, and also as far as my made-up words, one of my favorite made-up words was when I observed that of all the made-up words I've ever made up, that one was the made-upiest. There you go, made-upiest, my favorite made-up word. Okay, so anyhow, these are all the sorts of things you want to be thinking about and playing with. I want to come back now to Graham's harmonization here and talk about something that I'm perfectly okay with, but it's going to be okay if some of you listen to this and go, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Check this out. I'm going to play what he has starting right there. The next chord he has is A7 over C sharp, and then there's a C in the melody against it. So the question is, how bothersome is that? Or would you want to play your A7 for a beat, then change to A minor? I find that disappointing here. There's some places where that dominant going to minor sound feels good, like that 2 dominant going to minor 2 in the way that I was just talking about, or the thing that Stephen was just talking about, major 4 going to minor 4. It's a wonderful sound. We're going to talk all about it next week. Somehow the dominant 6 going to minor 6 feels backwards to me. I'd rather it go the other way around. And so it's really about whether we're okay with that dissonance. And when I just play it in slow motion like that, I'm not so happy with it. But I do think you can get away with it. I think you can get away with it. I think it's totally possible to get away with it. And if the tempo and the voicings and all support it and all. But here's another observation that you might want to consider. And it's the idea of using a diminished chord here. And the reason I suggest that is, so instead of A7 going to D, instead of 5 of 5. Oh, by the way, also, if I didn't put the C sharp in the bass, if the C sharp were in another voice, like, if I played that A chord here, you might think differently about it. So if I go, maybe I'll use this inversion here so that I have a descending bass line. Maybe we like that better, or just root position. Maybe we like that better. It is absolutely worth playing with these things. What I will say is, from a classical perspective, traditionally, you try harder to avoid dissonances against the bass than dissonances involving other voices. And that's one reason why diminished chords are so typically played in inversions, is to avoid tritones against the bass note. But that's not something I'm going to worry about here. But let's try this. So I'm going to do this diminished chord thing that I started talking about. And yes, absolutely, Allison, if you also then arpeggiate this thing or create moving lines as Graham has done and get the C sharp out of the way, that's another totally solution, another complete solution, another way to do it. Right? So I got away with it, right, by playing eighth notes. C sharp on the beat, and then walking down, coming down to an A against the C, and hoping our memory of the C sharp has been forgotten. And then coming back to the C sharp against the G. Now that idea of using the C sharp here, then getting it out of the way before the C comes, this has a term in classical arranging theory. It's called a cross relation. The idea of an accidental in one voice that is then conflicted, or it conflicts with, an altered tone, a C sharp and a C, basically, in one voice versus another voice at different times. And it's considered cheating. Most theory teachers in a traditional here's how you do SATB writing course will tell you you can't do that. But the fact of the matter is you can totally get away with it sometimes. So that's an example. I have the C sharp and I have the C, but not at the same time, and therefore maybe I get away with it. All right, but here's what I started to say about diminished chords. This A7 to D is 5 of 2 going to 2, right? So, but instead of using A7 to get to D, I could use C sharp diminished, get to D. Why do I say that's better? Well, because diminished chords are more tolerant of dissonance, especially I play as a fully diminished chord, because diminished chords are inherently more dissonant because they've got 2 tritones in them, right? So diminished chords typically are more tolerant of dissonance in that way. And as I've observed before, what we want is a whole step above chord tone. That C is a chord tone. Is a whole step above the B flat. So I'm more likely to be able to get away with it if I voice it as a diminished chord instead of an actual dominant chord. And then it's a question of, well, how do I voice it? Is it really going to work? Let me try it. Oops. So I like it. I find it less objectionable when I voice it as a diminished chord, and I could play around with the voicing that much more. But that's something else to consider, is use of diminished chords, making your secondary dominants not always be 5s, but sometimes 7s. All right, I'm now going to look at his bridge, because that was the part that I was really most fascinated by, because that was the one I was least comfortable with in the original, and thought that what Graham did is really clever. So check this out. I'm playing that bass line in octaves to emphasize how stepwise it is and how really nice it is. But I'll play it a little less heavily this time. Whoops, I'm playing the wrong voicings. So he is eliminated, not objection, but my question about that C in the middle of the phrase and feeling it was kind of weak, or not weak, but too strong, right? It was too weird to come back to that C in the middle of that phrase, and I didn't love the C at the end of the phrase either. And he has managed to get rid of the middle C there, the middle of phrase C, by using this chain of secondary dominants, 3 to 6 to 2 to 5. So suddenly that one chord is just gone because he's replaced the whole thing with that chain of secondary dominants. And, I talk about using inversions, not using inversions. I think this progression, I'm going to play it in a moment without inversions, is going to sound just fine with no inversions. But he has created a really interesting ascending bass line. So I'm going to play it his way first. Now I'm going to try it in root position, and I'm going to claim that both of these should work pretty well. And again, you can fancify your left hand. And I just put in some passing tones in the left hand to get me from root to root. But here, the observation that I had made about this is I really like that ascending bass line, but I think I would like it better if that C sharp got to resolve up to the D. I think I would like that better. Now we can leap into the F here. And by leaping into the F there, we at least finish our thought of that ascending bass line. Let that ascending bass line arrive on beat 1, then terminate it. And that's a generally true statement about voice leading and about harmony. You like to finish your thought and then do the next one, start the next thought. So by resolving that C sharp up to D, then leaping into here, to me, that makes a little more sense. But I love the use of the inversion here to get to a C chord in inversion to, again, soften or weaken that tonic. But also, I had done that thing of putting a minor chord in there, so I kind of want to try that as well. So I like that too. And that time I played the G chord in root position. It steps into the A nicely. So anyhow, I love this use of that chain of secondary dominance here. It just works so perfectly with the melody. And I just love it when that happens, when the melody works, in such a way that you can make a chain of secondary dominance work like that. So anyhow, great job, Graham. I'm going to just sort of skip around and briefly talk about, David had posted this about Light My Fire. Some of you know this song. Well, probably a lot of you know it. And this is like this kind of organ solo thing that happens in it. So that's basically the piece, right? That's the introduction. Is it the introduction? It's just like a little interlude. So it's a chain of circle of fifths, right? Except he makes the point that that D chord isn't really part of the circle of fifths, and it would work better with a C chord, and I agree. So it's a chain of that follows the circle of fifths. The observation I made is that it's going away. First of all, we don't even know what key this piece is in, but it's definitely not in A flat. I mean, you could look at it as being an A minor, and it comes to an A chord here. You could look at it as it being in the key of G. There's a lot of different ways you could look at this in terms of the key. We don't have enough context to know, but it's definitely not in the key of A flat. If you know the song, that's the only time these chords appear, right? It's not going to be about those chords at all. So this is a circle of fifths progression, but it's moving away from the tonic. And I just wanted to point out that that's sort of the opposite of what secondary dominants do. Secondary dominants tonicize chords in a progression that leads you back to the tonic normally, right? This 3, 6, 2, 5 over here, the E to the A to the D to the G to the C is that's a very strong circle of fifths progression leading us to the C, whether you put it in a strong root position or if you go with a inversions to create, stepwise bass slip motion. The other thing I've mentioned about the whole inversion business is the faster the harmonic rhythm, absolutely the more you're going to want to use inversions to smooth out the bass line. And also the more vocal the music is as opposed to instrumental, the more you're going to gravitate towards that. You will find, though, that using inversions in situations where they're not called for weakens the harmony rather than strengthens it. I think this is a great place to use it because it is such a strong linear bass line, and that's one of the places where you do want to use it, is when you can create that kind of magic. So anyhow, this circle of fifths is taking us away from the tonic, which is unusual. It's perfectly fine to do. It's just unusual, and it's not secondary dominance as far as that goes, but it's still relying on the circle of fifths. All right. I'm going to play through Kevin MacDonald's Amazing Grace here, which is also very well done. He's got like modulations in it, which is kind of cool. It's not necessarily directly relevant to what we're talking about, but it definitely makes it interesting. So, but he ends up with different harmonizations in each of the keys. So I'm going to play through this thing now. I had to do that. All right, I'm going to stop there before I look at the next version. So this is all really good. It's using mostly diatonic chords, but he's got that nice dominant 2. We're in the key of F, so dominant 2 to 5. And this is a case where the melody note over that dominant 2 here, it's the 9th of the chord. And I'm going to say that that's probably the most common chord that you will hear over that. You often will hear that chord there. It's not the only chord that's possible. I'm going to try something different in a second, but it's a very common chord to use right there. And that 9th in the melody, it comes down to the root and goes to 5. It's perfectly normal. But here's the other thing I could have done, or that I could do. Kevin did this, and I think it's wonderful. We could, if we wanted to try something different, and and does he actually do that? He's got the same dominant 2 chord in A flat also. So what if I took this 2 measures of 5 and changed it into a 2 to 5, right? So I'm going to make this C, instead of 2 measures of C, be G minor 7 to C. And then I can make this G7 be a D7 to tonicize that G minor. All right, so let's check that out. I'll start right here. D minor, D7 to G minor. Now that's not the usual way to hear that song, but it could possibly work. I could be okay with that. I didn't like it as much as I thought I would, to be honest. I don't like it that much for not really any great theoretical reason. I mean, the melody note fits the D7. It just sounds too foreign to my ears. But also, I don't love the way the G ends up working and then leaping out of it. I don't like coming from a nice chord tone A into this non-chord tone, avoid tone G, and then leaping out of it. So I'm not a huge fan of the sound of that D7. Could I do it this way? D7 to G minor to C7? I could, but that feels rushed. Anyhow, that's some more playing around with things that is totally worth doing. You want to experiment with things like that. Now I'm going to play his A flat version. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. That's really nice because his first 4 bars manages to go 1 to 6 to 2 to 5, right? And that's by the book. I mean, that's totally when you can write yourself a chain of secondary dominants 3 6 2 5, or write yourself a diatonic 1 6 2 5. You can always take that one to the bank. It's almost always, if it's going to fit the melody at all, it's going to sound good. So then the next question is, could there have been some secondary dominance in there? Could that 6 and or the 2 have been dominant? Well, let's find out. I could do that, right? don't love the sound of that, but I think I am going to like the sound of making that B flat a dominant. Dominant B flat. So make that dominant 2, secondary dominant. That's fine, but it kind of weakens the impact of the B flat 7 that's about to show up. So I think it was wise to keep this all diatonic. I didn't love the sound of the F7. I liked the sound of the B flat 7, but I want to save it for here. This idea that sometimes something is cool, but you want to save it for later, we'll hold on to that idea, because we're going to be all about that when we talk about borrowed chords. My minor 4 chord that I love so much, you can't overuse it. And by you can't overuse it, I don't mean it's impossible to overuse. I mean you don't want to overuse it. It's best when used sparingly. So we'll talk about that again more next week. But that B flat 7 kind of had that sound for me also. Just like, yeah, I want to save it for here. And then he goes to 5. Let's hear the second phrase now back in the key of F. Because I skipped over that. This, by the way, he has C7 over E. And this is one of the places where when you have a non-chord tone in the melody, this is one of the times you most want to think hard about possibly not using an inversion. Because the combination of not hearing a root in the melody and not hearing a chord tone, not hearing a root in the bass, and combined with hearing a non-chord tone in the melody, this is really, it's hard for me to hear these 2 notes and hear C7. And in an ideal world, I could hear the bass note and the melody, and it would already imply the chord. This doesn't imply C7 at all. So this doesn't either, but at least I'm only like 1 note away from it, right? So anyhow, the sound of the A over a C7 chord, having a 6th in the melody, not a problem, but definitely a time to think twice about the inversion. Now he has secondary dominant, right? F7 leading to B flat. And I love coming to the 6, to the 3 going to 6. I don't really think in terms of numbers. 4 going to 3, 6, 2. I mean, that's really nice. Again, circle of fifths. And then here again, we've got that 6th in the melody. And here, if you're not happy with the 6th in the melody, make it that. Make it 1, 6, 4. That's a trick you want to know. When you have, okay, there's some tricks. You can't learn every combination. This melody note over that chord sounds good or bad, but there's certain things you want to sort of have in the back of your head. We know we're going to have 5 to 1 happen a lot, right? 5 to 1 is going to be the ending of almost every phrase. So we want to know good ways of handling it. And this melody, 3, 2, 1, is going to be a real common one to have at cadences like that. So you want to know what you want to do. And this one, 3, 2, 1, with 5, 1 as your chords, that's perfectly fine. If I expand it to a 2, 5, that's also fine. Right? This is now the 9th over the 2 chord to 1. But the other possibility is 1, 6, 4 to 5. These are all ways of taking that 5 chord and expanding it in ways that might make you happier with that scale degree 3 or not. That you get to choose that. So there's a really cool thing that that Kevin does in the next phrase in E flat, in that same phrase in E flat. So look at let's compare. The fact that these are in different keys makes it harder to compare, but let's bite the bullet and try. This phrase here is 1 to 1, 7 to 4, right? What he has in the same place over here is a little bit different. Instead of 1 to 1, 7 to 4, instead of having a 1, he has this minor 5 chord. Well, what he's done is dispense with the 1 chord, say, hey, I don't need that. I want to take that A flat 7 and expand it. So instead of having A flat 7, he's giving us a 2-5 there. 2-5 to 1. So he actually just totally got rid of the tonic chord there and let that 5 chord bleed over into it by expanding it into a 2-5. This is totally a thing. When you have an opportunity to get rid of a 1 chord, take it. We got enough 1 chords in our life. We got enough resolution. I'm not saying that we want more tension in our life, but in our music, we want more interest. And the 1 chord isn't our source of interest. Motion is our source of interest. So this idea of dispensing with what should have been a 1 chord there, and instead starting on this little secondary 2-5 into 4, brilliant. I love it. Absolutely love it. So nice. That is lovely. Yeah, so this F over A is just, yeah. Normal chord would have gone back to 1. But, he's not doing that. He's giving us a secondary dominant there, an F7 chord. And he's voiced it by in an inversion here, which is fine. Doesn't really change it one way or the other. Could have been that way also. This sound, by the way, check this out. I'm getting to it. There's that F7. I'm approximating Beethoven, if you're not recognizing that from the lesson I did. That key of A flat, hitting that dominant 6, going to 2. It's a beautiful sound, and it has exactly the same feel. He's coming off of this 4 chord. Beethoven then did that little motion there, a 3-6. And he's got, coming off the 4 chord, kind of stepping into that, he's got, I guess, 2 going to the 6. But that using of the 6 chord in that position and in this key just instantly reminded me of the Beethoven. And it just sounded so lovely, so kind of unexpected. This is just beautiful. Just lovely. So great job, Kevin, on that. I'm skipping over a couple other things here. I'm going to focus on the secondary dominant ones here. So Beatrice has a version that she's posted here, and I see some things going on in here that really work well, and some things that I want to talk about how it's notated. But I'm going to play this as she's written the notes. We're in the key of G, right? All right, I'm going to just talk about that first phrase. So going from 1 to 6 totally works. Now, she didn't put a chord symbol above this, but this is basically a G7 chord here. A G7 chord with a D in the bass, so that's what that chord is there. When I first looked at this, I said, I didn't see what was written down here. I just looked at the chord symbols and the melody and said, well, something's a little off. And so I talk about harmonic rhythm a lot, and it's not like a piece has to have one harmonic rhythm that stays with it forever, but you do want to think about your harmonic rhythm and when you're deviating from whatever steady progression you may have established. If this had been the actual chord progression, then changing to A minor, I would have been uncomfortable with it. I would have said, well, that feels like we got to the E minor too soon. Why not wait until the next measure. Somehow having a hole at the beginning of the measure feels weirder to me in my ears than having the hole there. So if it had been then going to the A minor, that would have felt strange. But if the E minor had occurred on the downbeat, would have felt more comfortable to me. So think about where you're putting your holes. Don't put a hole in a strong position like that if you can help it. Now, in point of fact, she doesn't have a hole. She has a chord that she correctly analyzed down here. Or mostly, this is actually a dominant seventh chord. So instead of 5, 6, 4, it should say 5, 4, 3. But whatever, it's 5 of 4. This is a G7 chord in second inversion. And so there really is a chord here. And so she's got a nice harmonic rhythm of 1 to 6 to G7, 1, 7, basically. So that's a nice harmonic rhythm going there. Now, the thing that happens after that is a little less clear to me. I feel like it wants to resolve to the 1 here. I feel like this A minor chord is sort of getting in the way. Once we've heard this G7, I still want to hear the G7 until I get to the C. That's what I would want. Now, if you want to sell this to me as a deceptive resolution, G minor to A, that would be fine. G7 resolving instead of going to C. So in the key of C, this would be like 5 to 1. Instead of doing that, letting it go to A minor, that's a deceptive resolution. Those are perfectly acceptable in the context of secondary dominance. Secondary dominance can resolve deceptively, just like other dominance, just like regular dominance can. But then I would want this to feel more like an actual A minor chord. I'd need it to last longer. I need it to show up in a strong position, and I would need it to not be in an inversion. So to me, this chord is sort of weakening the progression. But if I just eliminate it and maybe switch to root position and then let it resolve here, then I like that a lot. So to me, the missing chord symbol here was one thing, but that one chord there is maybe getting in my way of enjoyment. And by the way, if you have this situation where your bass line arpeggiates the chord, you don't always have to put in both chord symbols there. If it eventually reaches the root, just call it C. And then if your bass line happens to not reach the root until beat 3, that's fine. You don't need to have both chord symbols necessarily. And now, so here there's a bunch, there's like, and someone else did the same song and I made the same observation about it. You're going to have a problem in that we know we want to reach the G chord at the beginning of bar 5. Now I'm going to want to have a G chord, whether it's in inversion or in root position. We know I want a G chord, the 1 chord at the beginning of bar 5. I really want this to be a 5 chord coming before it. And then the question is, am I okay with that G being heard against that 5 chord? It's the same issue, I talked about a couple times before. Can we live with it? Could I be happier with it if I voiced it as a sus chord and just didn't resolve it? That might be how I would do it. I would call it D7 sus. So she's chosen to call it G over D. But that's a little too one-y for what I would want. I want it to still sound 5-y. I still want it to feel like a 5 chord so that when I arrive in bar 5 on the tonic chord, it feels like I've arrived. So you want to somehow figure out how to keep the sensation of 5 going to 1, even though the melody doesn't necessarily directly support it. And yeah, anyone who ever plays this song deals with the same thing, and probably most people just play the D7 here and don't even think about the fact that the melody clashes slightly with it. Probably most people just do that. Yeah, probably most people just play the D and don't give it a second thought. But I think by playing it as a D7 sus, it makes me happier. E minor to... Oh, I love the dominant 2 there. And here again, we have some inversions that are here from a voice leading perspective. That A minor doesn't really exist. This is what we would call a neighbor chord. It's really a whole measure of E minor. That's how I would look at this. It's a whole measure of E minor that just happens to have a non-chord tone in the melody there. And that's probably really what's going on with that previous A minor that I was talking about is, yeah, it's motion, it's voice leading motion within a measure that's really a measure of G7. And I think that's more obviously true here because she's kept the E in the bass. So I would just call that E minor 7 and not bother labeling this as a separate chord. Just let it be voice leading, because that's totally fine. And then, yeah, this dominant 2 to 5, beautiful. And then coming, letting that resolve deceptively, beautiful. Coming to 6 instead of 1, and then 1, and back to 6. Now here, she's written B7, but her voicing doesn't support B7. I do have to talk about that, though. So what she wrote was what she wrote really is a minor chord here, B minor. So just a plain minor 3 chord going to 4, and that's fine. That is totally fine. Have a plain B minor chord, 3 chord going to 4. But I have to talk about what she wrote in the chord symbols, because it is super cool. And the same thing kind of came up in another piece. It was sort of not exactly, it was sort of hinted at. And so I want to make this point. This is another form of deceptive resolution. Let's look at this measure, E minor to B7. Where would you expect it to go? If that was all you knew, if that was all you knew about this music, you hadn't listened to the rest of the song before it, you weren't looking at what's happening, if all you knew was E minor to B7, wouldn't you expect it to come back to E minor? You'd think this was 1, 5, 1 in E minor. We expect that B7 to tonicize an E minor chord. Well, what this is a deceptive resolution of the secondary dominant. I mentioned that can happen, and this, what she wrote here in the chord symbols, is exactly that. E minor, so we're kind of in the key of E minor, and then we have our 5 in the key of E minor, but instead of coming back to E minor, it's going, instead of being 5 to 1 in E minor, it's 5 to flat 6 in E minor. That's a deceptive cadence, 5 to flat 6. That is the minor key deceptive cadence. 5 to minor 6 in major keys, 5 to major flat 6 in minor keys. Did I say that right? I think so. So that type of deceptive cadence gives you a dominant 7th resolving up a half step. It's another one of these sounds that's a wonderful sound to use sparingly. Every once in a while, that's a wonderful sound to use. And I think it's a wonderful sound here. So even though she didn't put the D sharp in the left hand, that would have totally sold that. The chord symbols she gives put it in my head, and I think it works either way, but the B7 works really kind of nicely. So going on. And here, again, I think this isn't really an A minor chord. I think this is really just 2 measures of C in which there's some inner voice motion. So we want to think about that, because one way to know is, does this really serve a harmonic function? Does going from 4 to 2 and back to 4 again move us along the circle of fifths. And if not, then maybe it's better to just think of it as non-chord tones. And then she's got this nice little diminished, this A diminished chord going to D. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about it some next week when we talk about borrowed chords. We'll talk about it more in a couple of weeks when we talk about diminished approach chords. But that is a really nice sound. Beatrice, your ears are definitely serving you well. It's in the melody, so you didn't really have a choice about the E flat. But that harmonization there is absolutely a great harmonization. So it's not a secondary dominant. It's not something we can explain yet, but we will be able to. So D going to a deceptive resolution to 6, 5 to 6, and then 2, and then our fancy 5. And so she has done her, this is that exact situation where I talked about our cadence is basically, 5 to 1 in the chords, but we have the melody going 3, 2, 1. That's going to happen over and over again, and she has chosen this fancification, the 1, 6, 4 to 5 to 1. So that absolutely positively works. 2, fancy 5, 1. So beautiful. So yeah, these are all really good things going on here, and I just there's just always so many things one can try, and it's secondary dominance is the one concept of everything that we're going to talk about that you basically can use as much as you want and get away with it, and it's going to usually sound very, very good. There'll be places where you just say, no, I think here I want the diatonic chord, like I mentioned in one of the other pieces that I looked at, where I said, well, I'll use the diatonic chord the first time that phrase happens, and then I'll use the secondary dominant the next time that same phrase happens. So, yeah, you do want to use a little bit of judgment as to how often you use secondary dominance, but don't be afraid to push further. I would say no one has put in so many secondary dominants that it's made me say that's too many. I don't think anyone has gone too far with secondary dominance here. So anyhow, that's I think all I got time to look at here. There was just so much great music posted here and so many great experiments here, and I've commented on as much as I could already, and I'll give a few more comments going forward, but thanks everyone for just hanging with us here. So next week, I will be coming at us from Florida, so I'll have the lessons up on Monday for the next section, which is a borrowed chords, minor 4 chord. That's the big one, but there's more to it than that. So yeah, I'll be coming to you from Florida for my live sessions. If you're attending office hours, I still have to work out exactly how that's going to work. I will probably broadcast from the airport a couple hours before my regular time is when we'll meet. So I'll send out notification about that. But that's what we're going to do. So by all means, keep getting in secondary dominant stuff. Just post some things, comment on each other's work, because that's, I think, how a ton of learning can happen is looking at what other people are doing, thinking about it, and giving feedback and hearing each other's feedback. So all that said, thanks again to everyone, and hope you're enjoying doing all of these projects as much as I'm enjoying seeing what you all are doing and talking about them. So secondary dominants are, again, the single most useful thing you're going to learn this entire course. It's a simple concept, but really getting good at applying it. We're not done talking about secondary dominants. They will we'll just continue expanding on that concept as we go forth, finding other ways of using them and so forth. But starting next week, we get to look at one of my favorite topics, which is that borrowed chord idea. So they have that to look forward to as well. So thanks, everyone, and see you next time. Bye.